Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christian Wild, and I'm here representing AIERTS. And it's an absolute pleasure to be joined by a fantastic co-speaker from the Institute of Internal Auditors for this discussion. We're incredibly excited that you're joining us for this session on applying AI to streamline communication and reporting. We've had upwards of 3,000 in registrations here. So clearly we have hit a nerve. There's high demand for this space, and we're really excited for the conversation today. So thanks again for joining us. I know how valuable your time is. Before we begin, just a quick note. This is a live interactive webinar, so please use the Q&A feature to submit questions as we go, and then we'll reserve time at the end to answer as many as we can, and what we don't get to, we can follow up. Now, the promise of today's session is really pretty simple. In many organizations, audit and assurance work is not limited really to effort or by expertise. It's limited by time, and the time it takes to consolidate inputs, align different functions, produce clear, decision-ready narrative. And that's what we mean by streamlining communication and reporting. And so today we're really going to make it real for you. We're going to connect that idea to a very specific reality in the internal audit profession that focuses on coordination across assurance providers, reducing duplication, closing coverage gaps, and communicating one coherent story to senior leaders and boards. And we'll walk through that step by step as to what that looks like in practice. So before we do that, just a couple of quick introductions. As mentioned, I'm Christian Wild. I'm the Chief Product Officer at AIERTS, where I lead the product and platform strategy for our full AI readiness ecosystem, and where our mission is to help train and certify 1 billion learners by 2035. AIERTS is the globally recognized independent AI certification authority, and we do that by delivering trusted, job-relevant credentials that help individuals and organizations build and validate and prove AI capability. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to David for his introduction, and then we'll jump right into it.
Thank you, Christian. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is David Petrisky. I'm with the Institute of Internal Auditors, and I'm the Director of Professional Standards there. So a big part of my job is promoting the standards and helping interpret and explain how they demonstrate value to their stakeholders in the work that they do. So today's presentation, as Christian mentioned, you're going to hear us connecting the dots between the requirements in the standards and what they expect, and how you can use AI to execute on those practical expectations. And this is not a presentation where we're introducing and talking about the technology for its own sake. This is about how artificial intelligence can help internal audit and other assurance providers coordinate their activities better, reduce the wasted effort, as Christian said, and communicate more effectively with the boards and senior management. So all of this, while still maintaining professional judgment, skepticism, and the appropriate governance.
Awesome. Thank you, David. So if we could move ahead on the slides, please, that'd be great. So we've covered off on the introductions. Let's get right into the session objectives here. So here's how we're going to spend our time. So first, we're going to establish the why now, right? So standard 9.5, elevated coordination and reliance, from a good idea to a true real expectation. Second, we'll look at why coordination still breaks down in practice, right? Not because people don't care, but because information is fragmented and taxonomies differ and reporting is still too manual, and there's just a lot of pieces to pull together. And then third, we will show exactly where AI actually helps. We'll talk about natural language processing and concepts like machine learning, assurance mapping, and generative AI in general, not as broad concepts and buzzwords in this case, but truly as tools that help you all normalize the risk language and surface overlaps and gaps and produce clearer executive communication. And then we'll spend some time on governance, because none of this works if the output is not trustworthy. And finally, we'll close out on how we measure success, and then how do we build the capability in a way that is aligned to the profession. So if we could just move ahead to the slides, please. Yeah. So here's, as I mentioned, this is what we're going to cover today. David, anything you want to add? Otherwise, we'll jump into it.
No, I mean, I think one of the themes we want to get across here is that AI is not replacing internal auditors. It's not replacing professional judgment. This is a tool that helps augment and really increase your capacity.
All right. So let's get into the heart of the discussion. If we can move along on the slides, David, I'm going to hand it over to you to set the stage, set the concepts, and demonstrate, show off your expertise here.
Yeah. This is kind of my day job, right? So let's anchor the discussion in the standards. So the old standards from 2017 said that coordination was something that the chief audit executive should do, right? And in the new standards, they say that the chief audit executive must coordinate with other assurance providers. So we've elevated that expectation from a should to a must. So this is something that's required. The main reason for that change is that the organizations that you're working in need to optimize their overall assurance coverage across the enterprise, and the chief audit executives need to focus their efforts where they can provide the most value. So the concept of all that is simple, but the execution can be hard, especially in larger organizations. So most organizations still conduct a lot of that coordination effort through meetings, emails, manual analysis of spreadsheets that can sometimes have inconsistent terminology and taxonomies, it's basically categories. And that kind of coordination is labor intensive, it's slow, and it's difficult to report on or maintain with confidence. So Standard 9.5 pushes internal audit functions to find ways to coordinate as effectively and efficiently as possible. And that covers all three of those points there, the mandate, the goal, and the reporting.
Yeah, and we'll get into it, but that's a great bridge to AI as well, right? That because AI becomes important here, not because it's trendy and because it's the buzzword these days, but because it can finally make this coordination capability scalable. So yeah, awesome, David. Let's keep moving.
Yeah. This slide here kind of breaks those expectations in standard 9.5 down into some requirement pillars, if you will. So the first category there is coordination. Internal audit coordinates with internal and external providers of assurance services. And in practical terms, that means just understanding who's testing what, how they're doing it, and why they're doing it, right? What are their objectives? What are they looking at? How are they testing? The second pillar is reliance, and internal audit determines whether to rely on the work of other providers through a type of quality assessment, right? And the IA issues some guidance in that area, but you have to first verify that the way they're doing their work, their methodology, and the quality of their work is sufficient for the internal audit department to rely on it. And reliance is I'll say, the hoped for reward of all this coordination, because when you can rely on somebody else's work, it reduces the duplication of efforts, right? And it frees up your internal audit resources to work on other things. The third, and I'm going to switch the third and fourth one here because I think the risk mapping leads to and helps inform the board reporting. So I'm going to cover the risk coverage mapping first. That is developing a comprehensive view of where the key risks and controls are examined and by whom, right? So if you're using part of your coordination effort is, documenting, well, who's doing what and trying to consolidate all of that into some sort of reporting, which we call risk mapping. And then the board reporting is who all of that is for, right? You're trying to demonstrate that, yes, this is, our organization has coverage over all the key risks, or, maybe there's gaps, but you want a holistic view of the risks and controls based on that coordination and reliance. And this approach helps unify the organization-wide reporting and optimizes the efforts to get there. So the key point in all of this is that Standard 9.5 requires that coordination, and the chief audit executives need an efficient, effective way to facilitate and document the basis for that coordination and reliance through mapping and reporting.
Excellent. And here too, AI helps, right? Because it can ingest that information continuously and generate that mapping and insights way faster than historically and manually.
Yeah, and so just to dive a little deeper into that, that challenge that the chief audit executives face, and all auditors, is that what we're calling here this communication silo problem, right? That this is why it becomes so difficult in practice to actually coordinate through old, manual methods. So most of the time, those older, non-technology assisted methods are inefficient for three main reasons, right? First is data fragmentation. So your audit, risk, legal, compliance, and IT groups are often operating in different systems and speaking different languages, even about the same risks and controls, right? They may use different terminology, they might categorize things a little differently. And so that requires, in this coordination, some sort of translation effort, right? Well, they're saying this, we call it that, you have to translate that. The second part is redundant testing, and this is where different teams end up testing the same controls, sometimes multiple times, creating what many of our operational personnel feel or call audit fatigue, right? They get the same questions from three different groups, and we're not sharing information, right? That takes away time from their main priorities. And then the third thing is hidden gaps, right? So some risks fall into this sort of no man's land between functions, right? Because no one has a complete view of the assurance map. Everybody is looking at things from their own perspective and maybe assuming that somebody else is covering the parts that aren't as critical to them. So you want to have that comprehensive view to find where these hidden gaps are. So the silo problem here is not primarily a people problem, it's more of a methodology problem. And it's about the inputs being scattered and inconsistent and the outputs being hard to unify into one narrative. And from an internal audit leadership perspective, these inefficiencies show up in three places, right? Wasted hours, strained stakeholder relationships, right? Why are you guys coming into it? We've already been tested for this. What's going on? And then difficulty demonstrating to the board that coverage is adequate and coordinated.
Thanks, David. Let's continue to move on. So with that, this is really where AI can act as that connective tissue. So think about the real job to be done here. You need to ingest information from multiple assurance sources. You need to standardize language. You have to identify the relationships and then surface what matters, right? And that is exactly the kind of pattern recognition and synthesis problem that AI is well suited to support. Natural language processing, as an example, just one of many examples from an AI perspective, can help normalize how these risks and controls and findings are described across functions, right? So, and then machine learning can help identify the patterns and failures and exceptions or control breakdowns that might not otherwise be obvious when the data sits in silos. And ultimately, when those elements are brought together well, that's where teams can work from a more unified view of the organization's risk landscape. So when we say AI can break down boundaries, we don't mean it replaces conversations, as David mentioned before. It doesn't replace the role, right? In fact, it dramatically augments it. And what we mean, it gives these conversations better input and better structure and much better visibility. So humans can focus on the core and critical decisions and actions and not all the work of trying to pull all those pieces together. Right. So as we continue along on the next slide here, let's get a little bit more concrete, right? So, at the front end, natural language processing, as I mentioned, can parse large volumes of audit reports and compliance evidence and policy documents and risk assessments and all the artifacts that are in play here. And it can spot the semantic overlap, right? Even when teams use different language. And that's really important because we know that's a pretty pervasive challenge in organizations and enterprises, right? And that's often the first barrier to real coordination. And then machine learning layers in that signal detection that I mentioned before, right? So it can compare patterns across the second line monitoring and third line findings. It can compare the patterns around operational events and exceptions, and then help teams notice concentrations of risk or control weakness earlier that or either earlier or may not have been found at all, right? And then finally, the automated synthesis of all this can keep that central risk view. It keeps it more current, so teams aren't debating which spreadsheet is right or which report is the newest. And this isn't just a workflow improvement, right? It's a full improvement around decision making and the overall end-to-end process, right? So and we know the broader market is moving in this direction as well, based on some of the data that's coming to light, right? So recent research found that 39% of internal auditors are already employing AI, and another 41% intend to adopt it within the next 12 months. I don't think that's I imagine that's not a surprise for most of you on the call here. So the question isn't whether or not AI will enter the function. The real question is where it will add the most discipline and value at the end of the day.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if I may, Christian, that emphasizing here that this is not a case of AI replacing internal auditors, right? Or certainly not replacing professional judgment or the independence of the internal audit function. The goal here is just to replace, or primarily to replace manual processes with technology-assisted ones, so coordination becomes easier and reporting becomes clearer.
So thank you, David. Thanks for adding that. And then let's get practical as well as we think about assurance mapping, right? So assurance mapping is where many organizations struggle because it requires constant updates and constant alignment, right? And AI-assisted platforms can play a huge role here because they can automatically map internal audit plans against compliance checklists and the risk registers, right? So they can highlight overlap. I'm making this up, but 3 teams testing the same IT protocol. While I'm making up, we know that's a reality, right? They can identify gaps, like a risk called out in a risk register with no planned assurance work. And then they can be dynamic, right? So these AI-assisted platforms can be dynamic in the sense that, meaning the map evolves as different functions update findings, or as the risk environment shifts, right? So the key phrase or the key point here is precision assurance mapping, right? The faster you can build and maintain an accurate map, the easier it becomes to coordinate and to report confidently, right? As David mentioned before. So let's keep double clicking down and thinking about more examples here. So here's an illustrative example, right? Imagine an AI model analyzes a cybersecurity insurance requirements alongside the internal audit plan, right? So it discovers that technical controls are heavily tested, but a specific requirement, let's say human element training, as an example, has no audit coverage, right? So that's not a small gap. In a real event, that could invalidate an insurance claim, right? So this is exactly what AI does well. It connects the documents and it connects the requirements across those silos, even when the language differs, right? So it can perform that semantic linkage that I mentioned before. So like spotting that data privacy and client confidentiality, as just one example, are describing the same underlying risk category. And it can monitor changes in the risk environment and flag where assurance hasn't kept pace, right? So where it's getting out of date, as an example. So it can compare across assurance providers, internal and external, to highlight whether or where neither party has performed recent testing on a critical control. And that type of analysis becomes even more important as AI-driven threats expand, right? So again, recent research highlighted by the IIA here shows that 88% of audit leaders identify AI-powered phishing as a top concern, is just one example. And 65% cite fabricated invoices or financial documents, and 45% point to deep fake audio and video impersonation, right? So, in that environment, these hidden gaps do not stay hidden for very long.
Chris, if I can just jump in and add one thing, is that the traceability aspect of the AI tools allows you to support the aggregated reporting that you're getting from them, right? So it turns that can be a powerful component to this whole technology assistance, because it turns that coordination and reliance into or that message into something that you can back up with data. Say, okay, here's, we're not just saying that we're coordinated and relying, here's the data that supports it. So that traceability is very important for not only validation, but also to increase the trust in the message.
Love it. Thank you, David. Thanks for bringing real world life example there. That's great. And so, okay, so let's talk about reliance now. So when we talk about reliance, we want to talk about it because reliance is a major level, a lever under standard 9.5, right? So reliance means internal audit may decide to rely on the work of other assurance providers, right? And that reliance requires confidence, right? So the question becomes how do you get assurance over the assurance, right? So AI can support this through automated validation, right? So for example, AI algorithms can reperform a subset of second line testing to validate quality and testing or quality and consistency again. And then if validation is strong, reliance can become more formal and better documented, and thus supporting the CAE's decision to rely. And that really has a number of practical benefits, but two to call out are, the fewer redundant audit hours and less disruption to the business here.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the theme that, on reliance and trust, the chief audit executive, isn't expected to just, blindly trust the AI outputs, right? Or even the AI reliance decisions, right? Because it can be programmed to assess the quality of these other assurance providers. But so that's why the traceability again is very important because it allows that human validation to say, okay, this is how the AI is reaching this conclusion. We continue to agree with it, and so we can continue to rely on the reliance decisions, if you will, that the AI tool is baking into this whole assurance mapping, right? So the with human validation, right? That would take if you try to do this without AI, it just it's a very manual and labor intensive effort, and so the technology really speeds that up and allows you a more closer to real time updating of okay, what are they doing? How are they doing it? Can we rely on that? All right, and then it's part of our assurance coverage.
Exactly. Thank you again, David. Okay, so as we move on here, I just want to highlight sort of a practical quality assessment matrix, right? So the way to think about this is, in one example, is through four questions, right? Is the work objective? Is the provider competent? Is the methodology sound? And then lastly, has the work proven reliable over time? And this is where AI can support these questions, right? It can help flag unusual language patterns that may suggest bias or inconsistency. It can help map qualifications or experience to the work being performed. It can assess whether required elements of a methodology are present in work papers, documentation, artifacts, and it can compare the current findings to follow-up results or later outcomes to identify whether a provider's conclusions tend to hold up. And so it gives you that validation. And then what matters here is not the specific numeric thresholds, right? I mean, I know we gave some examples here, but what matters is a concept, right? Reliance is strongest when quality is assessed systematically and then documented clearly and reviewed routinely. And that's one of the core messages we want to get across and ultimately how AI supports that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the thing, just like with other processes that the internal audit function goes through, having a structured approach and having a consistent methodology to the assurance reporting and the reliance that the AI is using makes the conclusions more defensible, right? Because you say, well, this is the approach, and we do some validation periodically on it to make sure that we can, the model isn't degrading, it's not changing on us, and we can continue to rely on these decisions, and that makes the reporting more credible and increases the trust that the board and senior management can have in the reports that we're presenting to them.
Precisely. All right. Well, let's move on to one of the most visible opportunities, and I'm guessing one that's very top of mind for folks on the call here, and that's reporting. And so boards and executives rarely suffer from lack of raw information, but what they suffer from many times is fragmentation, right? They receive multiple reports. They receive them in different formats with different terminology, different ratings, and different levels of detail. And this is a fantastic example of where generative AI can help close that gap by acting as that synthesis layer, right? It can aggregate inputs from from audit and from risk and compliance, and it can translate the highly technical language into the business speak and business language that executives can understand. And it can help create a concise executive summary from much longer material. I'm sure as many of you are probably seeing in your day-to-day lives on how you're applying AI already. And it can organize the messages around themes and implications and actions rather than around which department produced the source document, which is, a lot of where energy is spent these days, right? So done well, that means leadership gets one clear narrative instead of three partially aligned ones, or has to try to piece them together themselves. So, David, I know you wanted to jump in here and continue
So
talking about this.
I think this quote from one of the participants, summarizes things quite nicely, right? Your leadership in your organization doesn't want to hear two, three, or even multiple versions of where the risks are, what the coverage is, whether the controls are working or not, right? They want a unified message, and having that coordinated assurance, helps provide that, right? And using the technology to facilitate that coordination and that combined reporting is really one of the significant benefits from using AI. So internal audit sits in a position within the organization that is capable of unifying that view and unifying that message because we are independent of management. And we have that direct reporting relationship to the board. We can, we have the independence to choose whether to rely or not. And when we are effectively coordinating and, appropriately relying on the work of other providers, you get a more holistic and, really greater coverage view of where of how your risks and controls are operating. So that's one of the big benefits from implementing the technology in this way. And like, as you mentioned on the previous slide, right? The artificial intelligence is also particularly good at picking out themes and identifying things that have changed in the environment from or over the recent period. Discussing why that matters, right? What's the impact of the change? What is covered by assurance? Maybe what's not covered? And what decisions or actions leadership should take next, right? So the artificial intelligence can offer those recommendations even above and beyond the things that management may have thought of. So providing all of that in your reporting makes your communication more strategic.
100%. Fantastic insights there, Dave. Thank you. Thanks for making it real again. So, another core topic that I think is top of mind for everybody in this field, but frankly, everybody in the world these days, is around AI governance and ethical application of AI. And of course, what we've talked about today, none of this works if people don't trust the output, right? And going back to what David said earlier, this is why human in the loop controls matter so much, right? So AI can accelerate the analysis and drafting that we talked about. But at the end of the day, a qualified human still needs to validate material conclusions, right? And especially before they're escalated to executives or the board, right? The model itself also needs insight, right? If it drifts, if it overweights certain patterns or misses other patterns consistently, the workflow becomes less reliable over time. And we know that can happen. And so that's why it's constantly important, it's super important to constantly be monitoring and having those human in loop controls. And this is not a hypothetical concern, right? So recent research is highlighting that many orgs are still building the basics of AI governance. And so that means assurance teams cannot assume strong guardrails already exist elsewhere in the company, right? And in many cases, internal audit and these functions will need to help push that discipline forward for the entire organization, right? So, the principle here is really simple. In principle, it's simple, but of course, it's always the challenge is the implementation. But AI can support the work. But governance protects the credibility of the work, right? So that's the core takeaway here.
Yeah, and just add to that, for internal auditors, right, that ongoing validation by, human experts, it's not optional, right? We cannot just blindly rely on the tool and say, well, that we verified it once, back in the past, and now we continue to rely on it, right? It needs to be ongoing for there to continue to be trust in the work and in the conclusions. And so, when you introduce AI into your workflow, you need to have that periodic validation to for everybody to have that trust and confidence that the program and the processes are working as intended, and we can rely on the results.
Spot on, spot on. Okay, so well, let's talk about frameworks. I think actually great timing. If I can read the chat here, I need to get my glasses on, but I think there's a question about accepted AI frameworks that I can use, and really this slide names some of the frameworks that are increasingly shaping governance expectations, AI governance expectations. So ISO IEC 42001. Right, is a global AI management system standard, and it's focused on establishing and improving an AI management system inside an organization. NIST's AI risk management framework is another one that provides structured way to manage AI risks and promote the trustworthy AI. And then, of course, the EU AI Act is a major regulatory framework shaping AI obligations and governance expectations in a risk-based way. And I know that the U.S. government also just released early stages of a framework as well. And so the core takeaway is here, you don't necessarily need to memorize every clause of every framework to benefit from them, right? The practical takeaway is that not every auditor needs to become a regulatory specialist. The takeaway is that governance is becoming standardized, and organizations will be increasingly expected to show documented processes for AI risk, AI oversight, monitoring, and accountability, right? The trend and the expectation and what's happening in the market is very clear that those documented processes and that governance is going to be, pretty confident to say that's going to be table stakes for every organization here relatively soon.
And can I just add one thing to that
Of
real
course,
quickly?
yeah.
It's not unlike other software applications that you would implement throughout the rest of your organization, right? There needs to be a business requirements for it. There needs to be testing, implementation, monitoring. So it's very similar in many respects to just the usual software development lifecycle.
Yeah, fully. And so, let's also acknowledge some of the challenges that come with AI and get very specific about some of those failure modes, right? So one risk is hallucination. For those of you that are using Gen AI in your own either personal or professional lives, right? You've probably noticed that the output can sound very credible, but is not always grounded in evidence or truth, right? And another risk is around bias, right? Where an output that systematically emphasizes some patterns or underrepresents others, right? So a lot of that comes down to what is put into the model and how it's trained, and then on the ongoing tuning that David talked about before. And so in assurance context, either problem can undermine trust very quickly, right? So that is why grounding and review matter, right? So one practical control is to constrain AI outputs to approved source material and require the system to work from that evidence rather than from open-ended generation alone, right? So, and another method of control is periodic testing of the model behavior, as we talked about before. So you can constantly see and assess whether certain risk categories or business units or issue types are being treated inconsistently, right? And so that's core to how to look at this. And then all this matters because readiness is still uneven, right? And Audit Board released a 2026 Focus on the Future Research report, and in that it said 63% of organizations have not yet defined a formal risk appetite or governance framework for AI use, right? And only 28% of respondents were confident in their team's ability to audit AI risks effectively. And so governance maturity is still really catching up to adoption. And I will tell you, this is a real risk that we hear every single day as that authoritative, the certification body. Our customers our partners, even at dinner parties, people are constantly talking about how people within their enterprise mean well, but are off doing things that are completely outside the bounds or guardrails of how you want to use AI, and they're trying to reel all those things back in. So governance is just hugely important here, not just in general, but especially from an assurance and internal audit perspective.
Yeah, and that's where, the things that we're suggesting for internal auditors using AI, those concepts also apply when we audit the organization's use of AI, right? The situations that you were just describing there sound a lot like shadow IT, right? Which is a term that was maybe a little more common or prevalent a few years ago, right? That business units would start to implement their own applications without going through the standardized, centralized processes. And there are risks around that, but the control approach and the governance, as you mentioned, the concepts are consistent.
Yeah, totally. David, you mentioned shadow IT, and it triggers just for those of you that don't know, I was prior to joining AICERTS, I was at Microsoft for 18 years and ran a number of global functions and shared services across the company. And for so long, there was so much attention put towards shadow IT. And what's funny is it really, not just at Microsoft, but in industry, it died down because generally, the industry got a handle on it and managed it effectively. And I will tell you the number of times I've heard shadow IT or shadow AI in the last 6 months. I wish I had $1 for every one of them because of how prevalent that has come back to the surface. So it is real, and we're hearing it from every customer and partner for sure. All right, so how do we measure whether these AI-enabled coordinated assurance is working, right? So treat these numbers on the slide here as business case style targets or benchmarks, right? Not as promises that every organization should expect automatically. The right discipline, of course, is to establish your baseline first and then measure how AI-enabled coordination actually improves the process. And for some organizations, that may be unique or maybe broader, of course, than what we're talking about here. But you can start with cycle time, right? How long does it take to move from risk identification to leadership ready report? And then look at resource allocation, right? How much time can you shift away from manual document gathering, reformatting, and consolidation towards actual analysis and challenge and advisory work? So how much of that shifts? And of course, as I mentioned, the exact numbers will vary by organization, but the principle is consistent here, right? If your coordination model is improving, you should see movement in both these areas, right? Reporting should get faster, and skilled human time should move towards the higher value activities where we want those experts and professionals to be spending their time in the first place, right?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that demonstrating or being able to quantify the value or the benefits that you're seeing from implementing the technology can really make the whole program real to the board, right, and senior management, right? Maybe because I think a lot of probably the challenges and constraints on coordination and reliance in the past where it was such a manual effort that I suspect a lot of larger organizations like I've been in would have found that a pretty daunting challenge. But now with technology, you really can go enterprise wide and really you need those willing partners, right, to input their information into the system, if you will. But once you do that and you invest the time in that, you can get the comprehensive, holistic coverage, and you can do it without needing as many resources as it might have taken in the past.
Exactly. Thank you, David. So when we talk about KPIs that matter to the board, right, this slide just gives you a useful short list of potential board relevant metrics. Assurance velocity is all about and tells you whether monitoring is becoming more continuous and timely. Coverage density tells you how much of the strategic risk landscape has meaningful assurance coverage. Reliance ratio is another one that you can use to show whether internal audit is successfully leveraging high quality work from other providers instead of recreating everything itself. And stakeholder sentiment helps you understand whether the reporting is actually clearer and more decision useful. And the key here is not to create a huge measurement framework, right? And in fact, I think in general, I would always recommend, simplest is usually the most effective. And the key is to pick a few metrics that best connect the coordinated assurance to clearer oversight and better coverage, and then better use of the scarce capacity that is present within the organizations.
Yeah, I agree completely, Christian, right? That the metrics that you choose to focus on, they shouldn't be too, it shouldn't become a project in itself, to measure all those things, but focus on the things that the board cares about, right? The clarity of the message, the coverage of the organization's risks and controls, the efficiency at which you're able to provide that holistic view, and really the increase in accountability that all of that drives, right? What is the chief audit executive in the audit function focusing on? Well, if we're focusing our efforts on things that are already adequately covered by other providers, then that's maybe not the optimal choice, right? So you can demonstrate through all of this that yes, we are allocating our resources to the areas where we can deliver the most incremental value.
Yeah, 100%, David. Thank you. So one, thank you for your patience as we got through that, and hopefully you saw the big why and why we're here and why we're talking about it, and then how AI contributes to that coordinated assurance program. And so let's connect today's topic to a new certification program that was co-developed between AICERTS and the IAA, and we're incredibly excited to announce that we recently released this certification called AI-enabled coordinated assurance. And the program is precisely designed for internal auditors, risk managers, compliance professionals who want to apply AI in the way we talked about in a disciplined assurance context, really in the ways we talked about today and more. And so if you're listening today and thinking, I need a structured way to build this capability inside my team, that is exactly why we built this program together and what this program is built to support. And I will tell you, on a relative basis, the market response. We launched the certification a few weeks ago, and the market response has been extraordinary. It has been truly incredible. And so there's lots of people on LinkedIn talking about the course and have already earned the certification and the value it's providing for them in their role. And so we know that your peers are out there and already on this journey. So we encourage you all to explore this certification program, and it'll help you and your team and equip you with the practical skills and knowledge to transform that assurance function within your organization. And so all the details and registration are out on the IAA website and the AICERTS websites. There's the links at the bottom of the slide here. As well as the QR code to easily find the content or find the certification program and learn more about it and get started on it because we know how important it. And David, I know you probably wanted to mention as well from the IAA perspective.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's important for us to have gotten some practitioners in on the development of the course to make sure
Right.
that practitioner perspective is baked into the case studies and the other examples, and so just looking kind of scanning the some of the questions that came up in the chat. I mean, I don't want to sound too pitchy, but if you take the course, you'll get some of the some of the examples and some of the guidance on how to do those things that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you, David. And lastly, again, and then we'll open it up for questions on. I think we're generally doing well on time here, but AI. I mentioned this before. It's not just about transforming assurance, right? It's I think most of us probably see this every single day in our life. AI is reshaping every part of organizations. And frankly, to thrive in this era, we all must upskill ourselves and our teams. And we're seeing research time and time again show that training and skill, being able to apply skills is the highest driver of AI adoption. And I know personally for myself, my role has basically changed entirely in the last 6 to 12 months in a great way. And so I just want to call out the fact that besides the coordinated assurance certification, AI certification, AI Certs offers several other role-based programs. We have 70 odd certifications that are role-based, and not everybody needs the same depth or same pathway, but some leaders need more strategy and innovation fluency. Some professionals need stronger grounding in ethics and governance, and others need deeper understanding of the security controls and compliance. But what we've built is the role-based portfolio that's meant to support that reality. So, lastly, in the AI era here, relevance doesn't come from knowing every tool. That's not where people should be focused, nor should you in your role as in assurance. It really comes from knowing how to apply the right technology and how to apply AI responsibly within your domain. So we're going to pause there. We're going to open up for questions. Team that's been monitoring the chat, if there's some specific questions, let's get into it. Or David, if you've noticed in the chat, I know I saw a couple as well, but maybe David, I'll ask first. One of the ones I saw is it acceptable for internal audit to use Gen AI to draft audit reports? How accepted is this now becoming in industry, and how are you seeing it play out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say I just used it this morning, to help me with some of my work, and I'll probably use it again later. But it all depends on how you're using it, what you're using it for, right? So from an internal audit perspective, the professional judgment is very critical for our work. So again, you have to validate the output that you're getting. You have to make sure it's consistent and properly supported, just like you would with if you had one of your team members draft the first version of a report, right? You need to make sure the numbers tie out to the support. You need to make sure that the tone and the conclusions are adequate. And Gen AI tools can help you with a lot of that, right? And just really speed up the process of coming up with that first draft. But our function's credibility rests on the supportability of the conclusions, and really the benefit that our insight and our forward perspective gives to the business. So the Gen AI, it's a tool. It helps you writing, or it helps you with your writing, but you certainly wouldn't want to just set it and forget it and say, oh well, I trusted it completely or blindly, right? You want to validate that.
Exactly. Thank you, David. I've noticed that there's a number of questions around the certification and the content itself. There are, just to give the details, of course, are, if we could go back one slide, just so people can have the QR code again, if they didn't get a chance to use it, or the links. But certainly all the information is out on the sites there. In general, you should think of this as a 8 hours or a 1-day course. There's self-study materials provided, and then there's an accompanying professional certification exam that is roughly 90 minutes in length. It is 50 questions and has a passing score threshold that's been established. And again, all that is out on the site for more details if you want. Other questions? Maybe I thought I saw one before around David, around, does reliance mean internal audit now? Now that AI is in place here, or if you think about an AI assurance program, does reliance mean that internal audit gives up work to the second line, or how does that play out now in reality? How does AI change the way that that's worked in the past?
Well, yeah. So not exactly, right? Because, I'm sure reliance, at its core means that, you're relying on somebody else's work, so that you don't have to also do the same work. But, internal audit is an independent function, right? We can decide and we can choose not to rely on work that other people are doing. So that other work, has to meet some certain quality, expectations and quality thresholds for us to have comfort in relying on that work, and being able to redirect our resources elsewhere. Now, if the work that the second line is doing or other assurance providers doesn't meet our quality expectations, then yeah, there might still be a reason or a need to for internal audit to go in and look at some of those areas and do its own independent testing and verification of risks and controls. But the one thing as we mentioned earlier that the AI tool really helps with is speeding up that analysis of other assurance providers' work and in a way that allows you to kind of ingest new information and perform that validation in near real time, right? Whereas before, asking internal auditors to look at this stuff manually, and have to do that on each new engagement or other assurance provider that you become aware of, that just the time that involved in all that just makes reliance kind of infeasible or impractical in a lot of cases. And so internal audit functions currently, if they're not using technology in this way, are probably just choosing to not rely by default because they haven't had the time to verify whether they can rely.
Exactly. Thank you, David. I think another one, and I can take this one. I think I saw it earlier in the chat, but certainly one of the questions that comes up is, this seems overwhelming, or what's the fastest place to start if we want to pilot this? And David, please jump in here. But I would say in general, start with a narrow, safe use case where the value is high, but the risk is super manageable, right? So one example or a common place to begin is around the executive summary drafting from already approved audit findings, right? So that's a great use case. It's highly valuable. It drives lots of productivity gains. But the risk itself is very manageable as it relates to AI. And then another good pilot probably is around assurance mapping. And using existing audit plans and risk registers, right? So the key here, I think, just in terms of where to start, is to define the scope tightly, and then keep the source material controlled, right? And then measure the time saved and quality outcomes. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to baseline and then measure the time saved and the quality outcomes, because ultimately, your executives, your board will trust that AI is supporting and driving the gains we've talked about. But with real data and demonstration of that, this becomes so powerful and just gives you the momentum to build on. So just something to call out there.
Yeah, and if I can add to that,
Please.
that it's those initial efforts would probably be best focused on coordinating between the internal audit and some internal second line functions, right? Because you're all working for the same organization. You can get that support from the board and senior management to prompt people to share information and to work together collaboratively and to get everybody's information into the system, right? Because the tool is only as good as the information that it's getting, right? If it's not aware of the other assurance efforts, and it can't be mapping them. So and similarly, if it's not getting visibility into the type of work being done and the way it's being done, it has a hard time, or it may not be able to run that reliability assessment or the reliance assessment, right? So you really need to maybe work with some willing and able and supportive partners to at first to make it all work, validate the approach, and like you said, you'd be able to demonstrate the savings and in terms of effort and improved coverage.
Yeah, really, really well said, David, and super important in terms of grounding it. So maybe one more question, David, and maybe this is an unfair question, so I don't mean to catch you off guard here, but what should someone attending or in this industry tell the board about AI and its role with assurance coordination, right? How do you broach that topic?
I would say, I'm just kind of reiterating some of the significant themes that we've covered here, that the biggest driver is the efficiency, right? That one of the things, the standards require us to coordinate and rely, but
Yeah.
one of the biggest barriers, without using the technology to help us with that, is that it takes a lot of time to actually dig into what other people are doing, relate it back to how you would have done it, and see, well, can we rely? what, objectives and risks and controls are they looking at versus what would we have looked at. So the technology really accelerates all of that and really creates,
Yeah.
a lot of efficiency gains that, just replaces what would have been a lot of manual labor. And so it allows you to have a more holistic and coordinated approach. Where, like I said before, it takes a lot of time to get to that point. And so I think it's possible that a lot of functions just aren't coordinating as much as they could have been because it is such a, an investment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that comes to mind for me as well, I would also emphasize the fact that when implementing AI and using AI in these practices, I think it's really, there's a lot of risk aversion right now for obvious and good reasons at the executive level and board level. And I think the other thing I would do is when talking to the board is really emphasize and explain the guardrails that are being put in place, right? The human validation, the traceability, and how the team will monitor risks on an ongoing basis for things like the bias and hallucination that we talked about before. But certainly that would be another one that would come to mind as well. So we're at time. I know there's a couple questions. Hopefully you all have seen the discount code is on the slide here and in the chat. You can get to the certification to get more information and enroll using the QR code or the links below. Lastly, I know there's some questions around what upskilling certification do we feel is most relevant, et cetera. Like, we're here to tell you today that again, not to sound pitchy like David was mentioning, but we believe this one really it brings the practical application of AI into this function and allows people to upskill themselves and their organizations in a way that implements AI responsibly and drives that AI adoption broadly within organizations. So, David, thank you for your deep expertise and your partnership. I've had a ton of fun preparing and presenting with you. Thank you all for attending and your time today and your questions. How valuable your time is. And as I mentioned, please do go learn more about the program. Feel free to reach out to David or I on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat about how we can support AI adoption within your organization and David more specifically around assurance. And just have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Christian, for the opportunity.
All right, of course.